afternoon, everyone. Welcome to Books Between Bites. I'm Becky Hogue, and this is my mother, Betty Moorhead, and we welcome you today to, the mayor was our first speaker 31 years ago, and he's been here every year since, and he's been mayor every year since. Real quick before I'll let Mom introduce him, I always invite you, if you're not on our email list, to get monthly information about our programs. I have this clipboard, and I just ask you to fill out your name and your email address, and then I'll send you a monthly email. We have a large group now that I send out to, about over 300. Raise your hand if there is someone that wants to be on. Okay, and then I'll try to get to you, and if I missed you, I put the clipboard back by the counter, and you can find it after the program.
Okay. Well, I don't think that you need to have a lot of notices of who is coming today, because everybody's here, practically, who's not out in California or someplace else. Yes. So we're happy to have you, and I know that the mayor is always interesting, and we'll be delighted with having him here today. So we thank you.
Thank you. I'm not the mayor. I have no aspiration to be the mayor. I am the library director, George Sheets, and I wanted to take a quick moment. You see the sign over here that says "Speak Up." The library board has initiated a series of community engagement sessions, like town hall meetings, for the next several months, and we would love you all to participate. We want to get your feedback about the future of the library, what we should be doing, what you think we shouldn't be doing, what you think we might do differently. The first session will be on Thursday, February 1st. We'll have 4 different sessions, one a month after that. All of them will be at the Batavia High School cafeteria, which is very easy to get to right off the Main Street entrance. And there will be other, at the checkout desk, there will be bookmarks. We have bookmarks and flyers up here on the front table, so please grab one on your way out. We would love to have you participate. We're looking for a great turnout for all of these meetings, and thank you for your support of the library. And now, the mayor.
Well, thank you very much. It's an honor for me to be back yet again for my 31st appearance. I have to give the original credit for this whole idea to the late Reverend Lee Moorhead. He was the driving force that threw this out into the community, and then he came down in his enviable style and asked me to be the first presenter at the first time we did this. So it's been a great run, and I'm very proud of this program and what it's meant to the literary enhancements of the Batavia mind. And so I appreciate what we've started here, and hopefully this will continue for generations to come. Today I'm going to do, obviously I'm the mayor of Batavia, so my focus should be Batavia, and it certainly will be today. What I'm going to talk about is I started this a little bit last year, and I've got a kind of a special thing we've put together about Batavia in the movies. And I'm talking about the big movies, the ones that you go to the motion pictures. And we seem to have had, through history, an uncanny ability to get connected to a lot of different movies in a lot of different ways. And I think some of the stuff I'm going to share with you, some of these are relatively new movies. You'll find this quite interesting. I just want to say one thing about the town that hopefully most of us call our home, is that Batavia, for whatever reason, has had perhaps one of the most unique rendezvous with American history of any city in northern Illinois. And I say that because, 2 weeks ago we just did the recreation of the Saturday Evening Post cover. And after that celebration, I was at a meeting with a number of regional mayors in the area, and people had seen me on TV with Channel 2 talking about it, and then others had seen it in the newspaper. And there was a number, I'm not going to name cities, but there were several said, well, I'm really jealous of Batavia. You guys seem to always have these unique, very positive stories of your kind of your rendezvous with American history and things that have happened. And I remember some conversations I had with the Gustafsons and then later with the late Bill Wood about, they both recognized and realized that too, that Batavia is very, very fortunate to have had some really unique situations take place that, you know, looking back at it 100 years from now, people are going to say, boy, this place really shined. And so hopefully that's a momentum and a history that we will continue to emulate for generations yet to be born. So let's start with this year's program. Okay, this is a story about a book that you can check out here in the library, some of which has been turned into a motion picture. And the name of the book is Watch Your Step, and it was written by none other than William B. Van Noordtreek, who was a part of the original Van Noordtreek family, a descendant of the original William B. Van Noordtreek, who last year, you may remember, I told you the story of going to Port Edward, New York, and researching the movie 12 Years a Slave, because there's a line in that movie where the slave's down in his captivity, and he says, they ask him how he learned some things, and he said, well, I learned that working for William Van Noordtreek on the Champlain Canal in upstate New York. So I went to, with my wife, we were out there for a wedding, and so I had some time, and we went over to Port Edward and went into the museum, and they were very interested that I came in there because they were wondering about some information about the Van Noordtreeks, which I was able to send out to them. So, you know, our paths cross all over the country. But this is a picture taken in 1983 of myself as then the first term mayor of Batavia with William Van Noordtreek. And William Van Noordtreek lived in Midtown Manhattan in a penthouse apartment at 36 Sutton Place. Now, if you're familiar with New York City, Sutton Place is kind of one of the very elite addresses in the New York City community. And so he had a penthouse there, and he used to come after, I'll give Lucille Gustafson a lot of the credit for this. She got him in here one time and brought him down to meet me, and then he decided that he really liked Batavia and that he had ideas for us. And his idea was that he was going to leave a large endowment in his will to the Batavia community with the idea that we would be able to take the money and restore what is today the third floor of our City Hall building, which is where the Albright Theater carries on their plays, and turn it into a recreation of early Batavia. And he had in his penthouse in New York City, and I went there and saw it one time in 1984, huge collections of stuff. I mean, it was stacks on tables. And he had linens, and he had paintings, and he had photographs, and he had all this historic furniture out of Europe. And he had been a graduate of Princeton University in 1934. And he had this huge background in American and European art. So he was wanted to bring it all to Batavia when he died and set up this museum that he was going to pay for. And so he brought attorneys over, and he brought in architects, and he had all kinds of grand ideas. And so at one point he sent me a copy of his will, in which he made some family endowments and whatever. But then at the very first paragraph of his will says, "Be it known to all who read this," something like this, that I think her name was Elizabeth Rainey Van Noordtreek, is hereby excluded from receiving any benefits from this will because she abandoned me in 1953, and for reasons that are known to all of our friends and relatives, and so therefore she is totally taken out of this will. So one thing leads to another, and a couple years later, I get a call from his staff telling me he had passed away, and Batavia should start to prepare because they were going to bring moving trucks in. And I said, well, Jim Hansen was then president of the Historical Society, and Jim said that, you know, we didn't have any place really to put this stuff at the moment, but we'd certainly try to accommodate what was going on here. So about 2 weeks later, one day I'm at the city hall, and this receptionist calls me and says, we think you better come out in the hallway, there's a process server here. So I goes out into the hallway, and this guy serves me with an injunction that the Mrs. Elizabeth Van Noordtreek had filed in New York City, in which she was claiming rights to his estate because, as it was later proved in court, they had never legally divorced, and she was still his wife. And under New York law, as it was, Jim Hansen and I had to get dragged into this, as it was found out, his estate, she inherited 70% of it right off the top, and then she got another 5% of it for legal fees and whatever. So there was only 25% of his estate left to be dispersed in the manner that it originally was. But when it came to be dispersed, Batavia did receive a little over $400,000, which went to the Batavia Historical Society, and they still have that money. And their idea is that that will be some of the money that will be used to do the further expansion of the Depot Museum. Now, William Van Noordtreek was a very interesting personality. And when he was in Batavia, he would tell me various stories of stuff that he had done. And one of the stories that he was very proud of is that he was part of a U.S. Army team during World War II, which was called the Monuments Men. Now, if you're familiar, most recently there's been a movie made about the Monuments Men. And so you can go, here's a DVD of it. I originally thought maybe I'd show a couple tracks of it, but quite frankly, as I dig into this thing, I find that the movie and what Mr. Van Noordtreek say have great diversity in what basically happened. If you've seen the movie, it opens up with over in the Louvre in Paris, France, and there's a woman that's in the museum, and she's keeping track of all the art that the Nazis are stealing, and that they disdain this German officer who was there with them, dispersing, taking charge of all this stuff. And there is some very graphic scenes of what the museum staff does to show their displeasure with this German officer. So when you get William Van Noordtreek's book, let me find my page. When you get William Van Noordtreek's book, he has a whole section about this event. And in the book, he says, now he's talking about the German officer that is depicted in the movie as the ultimate villain, the guy that really does a terrible thing. And in that movie, they call the guy Stahl. Now, one thing that appears to me is every name of all the people in the Monuments Men's team and all the people that they were working with, they changed all the names in the movie, so that the movie is somewhat fictional. But William Van Noordtreek in his book says, a few years ago, I was the guest of Professor Graf Franz Hoff Matternich in Cologne, and was able to hear firsthand the account of his exceptional service to art as monuments officer for the Germans. For the Germans in Paris, and what he did to preserve the Louvre collection and deflect all the animosities of Goering and the other German officials. A few days, the Louvre treasures were evacuated to a chalet in Loire, and a few days before D-Day in 1944, General Eisenhower issued a letter to all Allied expeditionary forces with accompanying instructions to all echelons of command concerning the preservation of historic monuments and objects of art as they became visible to troops as they were invading Europe. And the Monuments Men were then called into action. So that's what he said about this guy that's in the movie is depicted as the ultimate villain. He says something very nice. Then there's this other scene in the movie where this woman who is keeping track of all the stuff that the Nazis are doing, he says about her, "I had a most interesting encounter while I was in my duties of touring Europe. Waiting for me was a woman in a French army uniform. She was Rose Valland. She had come to pick up some cases of memorabilia from Strasbourg stored in the Zwansburg Castle up the Neckar River Valley in northern Baden. These cases I found in a chapel during one of my inspections and was able to reclaim them through the monuments men. They had materials dating back to the European hierarchies back to the 11th century. Miss Vallard had been at the Jean de Paume Museum in Paris, the center for processing all the looted art bound for Germany. She kept lists of everything and was followed by the Gestapo. However, they never did detain her. The Germans packed up many boxes of great Impressionist paintings to be shipped to Germany and to be used as a bargaining point in any pleas for negotiations after the war was over, in lieu of total surrender. The story of the train which bore the pictures, took the pictures toward Germany was written by Miss Vallard in a book which has been made into a movie. The movie is entitled The Train with Burt Lancaster and was made. As a rail buff, my great-grandfather built 2 railroad trains himself, and as an art historian, the movie is of great treat for me. The story concerns the French underground and how they kept the train from leaving France by deviations on the spur lines, arranging wrecks on the main line to obstruct passage and creating very thinkable delays. The Allied forces advance caught up with the train just before it left Paris, or just before it left France. The film is still showing from time to time as not to be missed. So in the movie, in the Monuments Men, this Rose is there, but she's looked upon as somebody who is greatly villainized by the German command, and it's very contrary to what the movie is. So basically, in Monuments Men, we have one version in William Van Noordtveke's book, and I encourage you to come here and check it out. You'll read a total different subject, and if you watch the movie and read the book, you're going to scratch your head as time goes on. Let's go to the next slide. Okay, this is a copy of the book. Next one. And this is a copy of, you go to any place and buy that sells CDs, you can buy a copy of the movie. Okay, let's go to the next one. Okay, this is another interesting Batavia movie story. The gentleman that you see in this picture, many of you old-time Batavians will recognize as Elliot Lundberg, who for many years was a banker down at the Batavia National Bank at River and Wilson, and was for many years the treasurer of the Batavia Historical Society, was a lifelong resident of Batavia, except for the time he spent in World War II. Well, the late Bill Wood, who served as our town historian, and Elliot and several other gentlemen were very close friends, and they had a thing going that every Tuesday afternoon they would meet someplace and they'd bring out the pictures from the Depot Museum, and this group of old-time Batavians, which then included my father and Jim Hansen and Bob Kalina and Bob Phelps. There was a number of them that were all involved. They all got together, and what they tried to do was ID who all these old-time pictures were portraying. And so they did this for a long time. Well, one day, Elliot let it drop that he had been called by somebody that was working on a movie script about the U.S. forces' actions in the Pacific Ocean during World War II as it applied to the problems that were centering around the Philippine Islands. And so they were talking about making a movie about it, and there had been 2 books written. One was called They Fought with What They Had by Robert Underbrink in 1971, and then another one entitled, that was by Underbrink. No, that one's by Walter Edmonds, and Underbrink wrote They Fought with What They Had. In other words, there were 2 books written to detail the attempts to provide provisions to troops caught in the Philippines after the islands were invaded by the Japanese. And they had a plan. One of the movements was to get a charter of ships in Indonesia, load them with provisions, and then attempt to run the Japanese blockade. This was known as the Robinson Mission, named for Colonel John Robinson, who was heading it up. On his staff was a very small number of individuals, most namely Private John E. Lundberg, who was, along with 3 lieutenants, was on Robinson's staff and worked to design this whole idea of this invasion of these ships to aid those in captivity. To quote Robinson, Elliot Lundberg turned out to be the mainstay of our mission, the ideal man for the job. Both of these books chronicle their work in the Indonesian area, including the time, ironically, that Lundberg spent in the city of Batavia in the Dutch Indies, or where Japan had invaded it, but they were then calling it Batavia, and later the name of the town was changed to Jakarta, Indonesia. So they put together this whole plot and started to implement it, but the ships were destroyed, and ultimate failure to get any ships to through Corregidor was stopped due to the advancing of the Japanese Navy and military forces. And so finally, on July of 1944, after 3 years in the Pacific, Lundberg was flown home for a furlough, then returned to the Pacific, and he was discharged in August of 1945 with promotion to Master Sergeant. So Elliot had quite a story about this, and so Bill Wood got all excited that this was going to be made into a movie. And so I guess maybe that script's laying out there someplace, and maybe someday it will still be put together as a movie. But that's one of the things we also are having in Batavia is that we get people in here nosing around asking a lot of questions, and then when push comes to shove, they don't perform. So let's go to the next slide. Okay, this is the one book by Edmonds. Edmonds is the one that also wrote Drums Along the Mohawk and the Erie Canal book that's quite famous about upstate New York. And let's go to the next one. This is the Destination Corregidor, and that was the name of the mission that they had put together that Lundberg was part of. Now, the one thing I will tell you, thanks to the Batavia Library's abilities here, I was able, through interlibrary loan, to get a copy of They Fought With What They Had, and I believe this one came from the Wheaton Public Library, or Wheaton College Library, and then we got another one, we got the other one from DePaul University in Chicago. So I've got both of them here, so through interlibrary loan, if you want to get them, you can have them checked out. But the thing I will tell you is, as I did read most of what is here, Elliot Lundberg is very, very prominently mentioned in both of these books. I mean, this isn't just a passing one sentence. I mean, he's probably mentioned 15 or 20 times in the book for all the things that I think he must have gotten interviewed by these authors, and he gave them parts of the mission and whatever have you, and talked to them. So here's a Batavian. Elliot's daughter works up at the Homestead. He's obviously passed away. His wife was with him there. But they were very prominent Batavians, and again, they're very heavily mentioned in both of these books. So I just call that to your attention. Bill Wood even wrote up a special little preview about it, which I found amongst his papers after he passed away. And George and I have talked recently. We're going to try to put together a book of kind of all this loose leaf Batavia history that people like Bill have collected or put together, and maybe it's 1 page or 5 pages or 10 pages, and we're going to put them into some kind of a bound volume that we can keep in the Batavia room and then give a copy of it to the Depot Museum also, because there's a fascinating amount of material in this. So let's go to the next slide. Okay, this is one of the more interesting stories we have. This is the book Ticket to Ride, and this is the story taking place in 1964, the first time that the Beatles singing group came to America. Now, I don't know, most of you should be able to remember that. And when they came, as you may remember, they went on concert, and all the girls started screaming. And the minute they came on the stage, there was nothing but a big screaming noise, and people were passing out, and they had all these ambulances there to get the girls hauled out. It was a memorable moment in American history, and it didn't just happen one town, it happened all over the place. So what was kind of a little known fact about this very famous event is that there was a Batavia girl whose name, when she was in Batavia, was Sherry Lee Meyer, and she changed it to Jackie D. Shannon. And so Jackie D. Shannon was the opening act for the Beatles tour of America in 1964. So every time they went on stage, before they came on stage, Jackie D. Shannon came out and she did a little thing, and then there was another group called the Righteous Brothers, and they performed. And then you got the Beatles, but you listened to Jackie and the Righteous Brothers first. So in Ticket to Ride, there was a young reporter by the name of Larry Kane. And Larry Kane, he was up in the Detroit area, was very interested in this, and he got his boss to give him a 6-week assignment of just going with this tour through America. So he wrote this book about what happened. So in this book, there's some mention in here that Jackie D. Shannon was a very attractive young lady, and she had a lot of talents. And supposedly one of the things that developed is that she and John Lennon started having a romantic interest. And so this became somewhat of an agitation to the other three brothers, because I guess they thought Jackie was okay too. So about 2 years ago, now most of the prominent Batavia historians are now dead, and there's places you can either call the Depot Museum or maybe George Sheets or Stacy, or you can call the mayor. That's about where the references go to. So I get the call from some gal in Hollywood, and she's telling me that she's part of a team, and they're sitting down and they're writing a movie script that they're going to trying to sell that will be the story of the Beatles' first tour in America. And quite frankly, I would tell you that my opinion would be that if that ever got made, there'd be a lot of people that would go watch that movie. But obviously, the movie, as she told me, has to be more than 4 guys, with long hair running around singing on a stage. That there had to be like a plot to it and things going on. And so this little inner reaction between Jackie D. Shannon and Paul McCartney, or John Lennon, was one thing that they wanted to research. And I said, well, she left Batavia about 1957, 58, and maybe she's been back once, and I can maybe refer you to some of the, I'll call them old timers that were classmates of hers. We still have a few of those folks in town, but so then she was nosing around. Was there other stories like that about her in Batavia? I said, well, I was still pretty young when she was here. I don't remember hearing anything, and nobody shared anything to me. So she says, we're going to have to see where this goes. She says, we have one problem with this movie, and that is that the movie has all these songs in it. And the Beatles, later on in their career, decided to put all the songs up for sale. And they sold the rights to all these songs to various individuals. So it's not like you can go to one place and get a blanket permission to use all of their repertoire. You've got all these other people that now have their hands. And I guess the estate of the late Michael Jackson bought a bunch of these and had a whole bunch of the. So she says, I know there's been some negotiation going on with the people involved trying to get this stuff assembled, because apparently when they did the tour, there was kind of a standard set of songs that they sang. And if they were to deviate, there'd be a lot of people who were at some of those tours and say, well, they got this wrong or they got that wrong. So she said they're trying to be historically correct, but she said the numbers that are being floated out there for buying the rights for these songs to put them in the movies is huge numbers. And so it may not come together, because just the cost of trying to assemble all this and put it together, given how the whole Beatles repertoire was distributed throughout the country, may not make it very easy for this to happen. She says maybe in a few years from now, maybe the price will go down. But so I will tell you, this could be another one if it ever shows up. and you have a Batavia interest, it sounds like somebody portraying Jackie DeShannon, alias Sharon Myers, will be a prominent fixture within that movie, because the script I think may have been written, but the cost of putting it together. But if you've watched recently what we're doing with movies, there's been a lot of kind of historical types of things that have come out in the last few years here on various things, and they've proven to be very popular movies. So I would think that this one would be especially very popular, because there were hundreds of thousands of people who probably got into those concerts when they were being held that year. And then there'd be grandchildren and everything else now by a lot of those people who would find that all very interesting. So I think it's a top-notch movie, but just trying to put it together sounds like it was going to be monumental. But I wanted you to know that they did call Batavia, and they did ask questions about putting our Batavia girl into the movie. So I don't know any more about it than that, but the question was asked out there. Let's go to the next one. Do I have a problem with my sound here? It sounds like something gave... Wireless is quit? Okay. As long as I speak into the... Okay, this is a kind of a rare book about Mary Todd Lincoln. It was written back in the 1930s by Carl Sandburg. And I was able to find this down at a museum in central Illinois, near where Carl Sandburg lived. And so I picked it up and bought it, and it talks a little bit about Mary Todd Lincoln's stay in Batavia, but doesn't put a lot of emphasis on it. I found that interesting, that he didn't pay much attention to what was being said in the, all the stuff. Now, I've kept a collection, starting with Bill Wood. He started collecting them, and I've kept it up. I think right now I've got 17 books in my collection that have been written about Mary Todd Lincoln and her illness and her stay in Batavia. And I will tell you that I probably have the tape someplace, but I have been hauled down to Bellevue, because I'm the last survivor, I guess, of this whole thing, as far as knowing something about what happened here. I've had the History Channel, the Home and Garden Channel, the Travel Channel, and HGTV at different times take me down to Bellevue, and I do a little thing about this is where she was in 1875 from, when was it, May 20th till September 9th, I think are the dates that she was here. And so then I've been on Channel 9, Channel 7, I've not been on Channel 5, but I've been on Channel 2. And so and I will tell you now, as time goes on, we get more inquiries at City Hall through the year of people straying in the door wanting to know where this sanitarium or asylum was that Mary Todd Lincoln was at. And people come from literally all over the world. And I met a bus 2 years ago full of people from Japan who were on a history tour of suburban Chicago. And Jefferson and Union is the highlight of the street, of people coming down, getting out, taking pictures, walking around a little bit. Now, in my days as mayor, I got a lot of memories of this, because the Bellevue building, after Fox Hill Home was there, after they left, the Bellevue building was abandoned for a while, and it became... people were breaking into it and sleeping in there, or shouldn't have been in there, and whatever. So in 1982, I hired a new gentleman to be the fire chief, and we took him on a little tour to show him Batavia, and we went down to Bellevue. We got inside the building, and we found evidence. It's funny, we had the new fire chief with us, but there was the city building inspector and myself at the time. We found evidence that there had been 3 fires set in the building, but whoever set the fires didn't know how to set a fire, and the fires had been like piles of paper against a plaster wall, and the fires burned themselves out. But there was the evidence that they had been set. Somebody tried to burn the place down. Fortunately, it didn't work. So, I was, as a historian, that really is a significant story to our town. So I spent a lot of time for a few years talking to different people about our need to do something to keep Bellevue. And so lo and behold, one day a developer came in from Joliet His name was Mandy Corporation, and they wanted to buy Bellevue, and the deal was is that they would agree to restore the old building if we, the city, would allow them to build 39 townhouses in the open area that surrounded it, starting on Jefferson Street and going around the building and coming back. And so we agreed to that. Well, he got going and he built the first 4 of them. And if you go there today, you can tell which ones they are. They're on the south side of the circle, right by Jefferson Street. There's 4 townhouses in there that are a little bit different in design. He started the restoration on the building because that was paramount to the city. And he said, okay, we'll do it. And then about, I don't know, 3 months later, he calls me back and he says, well, I'm sorry to have to tell you this, but I had a couple of my other developments fail on me, so I'm going to have to declare bankruptcy and shut the Bellevue plan down. So he shut it down. So then we went back in for another almost 9 or 10 months to do it. And then we had some local residents all of a sudden show up, and they had assembled some money, and they said, well, we'd like to take this on and do it, but our people have come in and said that there's too much density in these townhouses, and we want to reduce the number of townhouses and make them nicer, put in basements and stone outsides on them, or facades. We want to reduce the numbers from 39 down to 32. So we want to reduce it by 7 and make the units bigger because we'll be able to sell them for more money. So they did, and they did. It all worked out. I mean, the rest of that development is a really great addition, in my opinion, to Batavia. It really has turned things around. But we still have, on an ongoing basis, we have the people showing up all the time. Now, the part of the existing old building, which was the one we almost lost through the arsonist, has been turned into 14 rental apartments. And a number of those are occupied by people who work at Northern Illinois University. An interesting sidebar story to that is there is a couple that live there. They're very good friends of mine. And the wife is a comedy writer. And she writes comedy. And she worked for a firm that was in charge of writing the opening 10-minute dialogue every night for the David Letterman show. And once or twice a week, she used to get on the computer and Skype with these other writers from throughout the United States, and they'd throw around ideas or stories that they had heard. And from that conversation, they would write these dialogues that David Letterman would come on every night and say. And so some people caught on to it, but in that dialogue for the last few years, while David was still in business, there were several times when Batavia, Illinois was, in a comedy sense, was mentioned in reference to things that went on. And there was also some jokes about the Aurora City Council, and I mean, there was stuff all over, and it was this lady sitting on South Jefferson Street that was putting this together and putting this out. So again, great histories here. So about, when was this? About 18 months ago now, one day, I get a call from a guy out in California, and he's a script writer. And he says, I'm here working with the History Channel, and we're going to do a movie about an hour or so long about Mary Todd Lincoln's stay in Batavia, and it's going to be, you know, kind of a fictional thing. It's going to have actors and whatever, and we're going to want to come to Batavia, and you got those townhouses out there in front of it, but we'll be able with a computer to take pictures of the building and take the townhouses out of it. Fine. So anyway, then he starts in on me. He says, now we got to make this movie interesting for people to watch. So one of the things he says, I'm told you're one of the historians in town, and I know this guy called Carla Hill too, and he didn't get anywhere with her on this. He says, we'd like to come up with a little story here about how one of the runaway slaves who came up the tunnel from the Fox River into Bellevue, came up and snuck into Mary Todd Lincoln's room and was sleeping at the foot of her bed one night. And I says, now wait a minute. time out here altogether. Mary Todd Lincoln was here in 1875. The American Civil War had been over with for 10 years. Her husband had been murdered. And more interestingly, when we ended up getting involved in this restoration of the Bellevue buildings, this thing about these tunnels has been around for a long time. Now, we assigned the city crews, that the building inspector and everybody else that was doing, we had to put in all new water and sewer and electric and storm sewers and everything. So virtually the entire outside of the old building was dug up during this process, and we put stuff in. So they were told, keep your eye open to see if you see any type of evidence that there was a tunnel here in some form or fashion. We never saw anything in the whole experience. So then, you know, I had another guy come in, and Reverend Moorhead used to have a friend named, the last name was Neely, who wrote the Lincoln books. Mark Neely, was it Mark? Yeah, Mark Neely. So he came once or twice, and Lee and Bill Wood and I put him in the car, and we rode around all that area and whatever have you. And he was commenting about that, you know, there were people that were saying that there was runaway slaves being kept in this place and whatever. And he made the comment, he says, you know, to be the runaway slave, it had to predate the American Civil War. Well, Bellevue had been built about 1854. So there may have been about a 6-year period where something could have happened. But in 1854, there was no heavy machinery. There was no way to build something of a tunnel from the Fox River up to Bellevue, which I believe is 1,485 linear feet running, and then you'd be in the ground trying to moving all of the stone out of there because it was all limestone. But he says, you know, most interestingly, you were before electricity and ventilation. So you get some poor runaway slave here, and you're going to send them up to Bellevue. You give them a lantern or a torch, and you tell them to run up this tunnel 1,485 feet, and they get about 300 feet in the building, and then they die of carbon monoxide poisoning. So this whole idea of these tunnels, it's still out there, and I still have people tell me, some people that live over there tell me that they think they've got a tunnel underneath their house someplace, and we're saying, well, we don't think you do because we've never found it, and that's kind of one of the Batavia stories. But so anyway, this guy from the History Channel gets very upset with me, and I believe he called Carla and got upset with her too, that we would not in any way, shape, or form collaborate that we had these tunnels in town. And so at the last I knew, he says, well, I guess this isn't going to go anyplace. Thank you for your time. Goodbye. Well, then I was told about 6 weeks later that they had a film crew down at Bellevue, and they were doing something down there. So I get in the car and I drive down there, and I come up Union Avenue to Jefferson Street, and as I'm coming down Jefferson Street, I get about in front of Mark and Terry Allen's house, and I can see this tall figure standing right at the corner, and here's Abe Lincoln. standing at the corner, and I'm like, this don't make any sense, because Abe Lincoln had been dead for 10 years by the time his wife got here. So I've never heard what we ever did with this little thing that they did down there. They had Abe performing in the front yard, and so you just don't know what Hollywood's going to reinvent or remake. So Batavia has to be kind of on its guard for stories of where this is all going to go, because we constantly have, you know, people in here wanting to reinvent or rewrite history, as I think we did with the Monuments Men. I think if William Van Noordtje could have seen that movie, he was very outspoken in his opinions. He would have had plenty to say about that movie and how they portrayed various people and whatever. So, you know, we've had our moments with Hollywood and how things go. Let's go to the next slide. Okay, this is staying on the Lincoln thing for a moment. This is the book, The Team of Rivals, which was written by Doris Kearns Goodwin, who has won the Pulitzer Prize for her writing. And so I read, this is a very good book. I mean, historically, I think it's right on, and she did a lot of research. and there's been a lot of, things about Lincoln that have been uncovered over the last few years that people didn't previously know. I got to point out to you this, though. This kind of, I think, is kind of an interesting little tidbit. At the very end of Team of Rivals, the very last paragraph in the book, Doris Kearns is on to the, kind of what happened to Lincoln and all those that surrounded him. And so the last person that she touches on is Mary. And I just want to read you a brief part of the paragraph here. This is the last paragraph in the book. Mary's misery was compounded by her ever-consuming worries over money. Quote, "It is very hard to deal with one who is sane on all subjects but one," Robert confided to Mary Harlan, the young woman who would become his wife. "You could hardly believe it possible, but my mother protests to me that she is in actual want and nothing I can do or say will convince her to the contrary." End of quote. Her increasingly erratic behavior persuaded Robert to commit her to a state hospital for the mentally insane, where she remained for 4 months until she was released to the care of her sister Elizabeth in Springfield. Now here we have Pulitzer Prize winner writing about Batavia, and she proclaims Bellevue to be a state hospital. Now, if all of us in this room who have read this know that that was a privately owned medical institution by the Patterson family, and there was nothing state about it. There was no state money, no anything. So, not, even in the Pulitzer Prize world, you can still make literary mistakes. We have had a real interesting run on books and stuff, and I would suggest that given the calls that we've gotten, we may not be over with yet. I had the opportunity to meet a gentleman, and I don't know, I guess I don't want to ever, who showed me a manuscript that he had written about growing up on the southwest side of Batavia between 1945 and 1955. And he was going to take it out. I didn't get a chance to read it, but he said he was going to try to find a publisher. He didn't live in Batavia. He was from out of town, and he's trying to get this book published about his life in Batavia as a kid growing up. And so he had some questions. He had a lot of interest in, like, on Elm Street, and he knew a bunch of the names of the people that lived there. So he was asking about, well, Lou Duncan, who was the high school English teacher, and he was asking about Bill Benson, who many of you remember used to do the songs and churches and that in town. And he was asking about Bob Thorson, who owned the lumber company down over on Main Street. And so I'm assuming that maybe this is going to be published sometime, and we'll, obviously, I'm sure George will bring it in and put it in the library. He didn't purport that it was any type of a scandalous book. He wasn't like looking for Jackie DeShannon's story with John Lennon. But there are a lot of people that want to create the quote-unquote memory book and put stuff out there that we can remember and savor. So Batavia has just a fabulous degree of history going on, and I've had people tell me that if you look at, as I told the football team, we had the Batavia High School football team that won the state championship down to the city council on Tuesday night, and we gave each one of the players a certificate from the city of appreciation for their accomplishment. And as I told them, Batavia is really, a lot of people envy what is going on in Batavia and other towns I'm talking about. And the fact that, now we've won 2 state football championships in 4 years, Geneva and St. Charles have never done that, or whatever. And then we have all this great stuff down in my office at City Hall, and I'll confess to this. I have a bunch of Batavia pictures hanging on my wall, and one of them I have is of the Batavia High School basketball team, which played on this site in 1965. And it's a picture out of the Batavia High School yearbook in 1965-66. It was the 66 book. And in that picture,
there are three players. One was Byron Von Hoff, who signed a professional baseball contract with the New York Mets. Another one is Dan Issel, who, when he retired, was the 5th all-time high scorer in the history of professional basketball. I think he's lost that rank now with some of these new guys, but he still was fabulous. And then there's Ken Anderson, who was with the Cincinnati Bengals and was the starting quarterback in the 1982 Super Bowl. So on this one Batavia High School basketball team in 1965-66, we had 3 players that signed professional contracts in what was then the 3 major sports: basketball, football, and baseball. And I bet you we're the only town in the whole state, maybe the whole country, that can throw that on the screen and boast about it, because those things just don't happen. So I'll close with this story about my exuberance for kind of the uniqueness of the Batavia story. For many years, the longest serving mayor in the state of Illinois was Don Stevens, who was the mayor over in Rosemont. And when Don died, his son Brad succeeded his father as the mayor. And Brad is still the mayor, but it's not the same guy. So Brad's now only been in office, I think, 3 or 4 terms. His father, I think, was in office for 13 terms. So they've been there since Rosemont was started. So through some unique sets of circumstances, Brad Stevens is a very powerful mayor because, you know, the city owns the All-State Arena and the Rosemont Theater. So they have access to all these great acts, and that's where many, I'm sure most of us in this room have been to Rosemont to see something, and they got that now enclosed shopping mall. So through another set of circumstances, I worked with Stevens on some stuff, and we became pretty good friends. And so he tells me one day, he says, you know, he got that football head player that out at the Batavia High School, you got this head out there that's blowing up when there's a game, and the team runs out from underneath the head. He says, well, I gave him the money to buy that head, kind of, because I gave him a number of tickets to a certain individual in town who doesn't want to be named, and he donated the tickets and got them sold off in raffles and whatever, and they raised enough money to buy that football head that you see sitting out there on the football stadium. So he says, I did that, and then he gave a bunch of money to help the sports boosters put the turf down that they're agreeing to put down and not put it on the backs of the taxpayers, which is the most commendable thing. But anyway, Brad Stevens very quietly has been one of the great financial resources to the town. So one day, some other stuff was happening, so I said, would you like to come out? We're going to have the groundbreaking of the new football field with the turf on it. Since you've been the benefactor, I'd like to have you come and be introduced. And I talked to the school district, and they said sure. So anyway, I invited Brad to come out early so I could give him a tour of Batavia. So I put him in my car, and we start going around. I show him Bellevue, Mary Todd Lincoln. I show him the Methodist Church with Reverend Moon, who was the grandfather of Buzz Aldrin. You know, I'm kind of bragging the place up. Then I take him out on East Wilson Street, and I get to 713, and that's the house where, for a long time, Sherry Myers, alias Jackie DeShannon, lived. And she won the Grammy Award for the song Put a Little Love in Your Heart, and What the World Needs Now is Love in 1983. So she's the Grammy Award winner, and she lived at 713 East Wilson Street. Then I take him just down the street about 2 blocks to the corner of Redant and Wilson, in front of what is today Bob Dazzle's towing business. And you know, it's a towing business. So I say to him, right here in 1973, 20th Century Fox came to Batavia and made scenes from the movie Harry and Tonto starring Art Carney. And in 1975, Art Carney won the Academy Award for Best Actor because of his portrayals in this movie. And so I got the Grammy Award here, and 2 blocks down the street I got the Academy Award. But I said I'm not done yet. So I take him out to the end of Wilson and Kirk, and I pull into the new Speedway gas station, and I face to the south, and I point to the clump of trees that's right at the corner of Wilson and Kirk that's recently been cut back so you got better visibility on the corner. And I say, in that clump of trees is the house where the executive director of Fermilab lives, and it's whoever's the executive director moves into that house. But I said in 1989, when he won the Nobel Prize for Science, Leon Letterman lived in that house. So right here on Wilson Street in Batavia, we've got the Nobel Prize, the Academy Award, and the Grammy Award. And so Steven says to me, he says, you know, I got a lot of stuff going on in Rosemont, but I can't top that. So it's about time for me to shut up. So I thank you all for coming and look forward to seeing you next year.